When most people think of the ancient world's first great empires, their minds travel east, to the rivers of Mesopotamia, to the monuments of Egypt, to the city-states of Sumer. The story of civilization, as it is commonly told, tends to follow those familiar routes. But there is another land, sitting at the very crossroads of continents, where some of history's most consequential chapters were written, and where the very architecture of empire was being assembled long before many of those stories reached their peak. That land is Anatolia, and its history is far older, far richer, and far more world-shaping than most people have ever been told.
To understand Anatolia's place in history, one must first understand its geography, because in the ancient world, geography was destiny. The Anatolian Peninsula occupies a position unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. It is bounded by water on three sides: the Black Sea to the north, the Aegean to the west, and the Mediterranean to the south. Its interior is dominated by a high central plateau, a broad, semi-arid tableland ringed by mountain ranges that break the land into natural corridors and valleys. Rivers cut through the highlands and descend toward fertile coastal plains. This combination of terrain created something rare, a land that was simultaneously difficult to fully conquer and impossible to ignore.
As early as the 10th millennium BCE, human communities in Anatolia were already doing something remarkable. At a site in southeastern Turkey, known today as Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherer groups carved enormous limestone pillars into T-shaped forms and arranged them in elaborate circular enclosures. The carvings depicted animals, foxes, vultures, scorpions, rendered with a skill and intentionality that speaks to a symbolic inner life of considerable depth. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture, it predates pottery, it predates the wheel. And yet it represents organized communal effort on a scale that demands coordination, planning, and perhaps something approaching shared belief. What it means precisely remains one of archaeology's most compelling open questions. But what it tells us clearly is this: Anatolia was a place of human complexity very early in the story of our species. Several millennia later, by the 7th millennium BCE, another site had emerged that would become one of the most discussed settlements in all of ancient history. Çatalhöyük, located on the Konya Plain in south-central Anatolia, was a densely packed town of mud brick structures, housing perhaps 8,000 people at its height. Its inhabitants entered their homes through holes in the roof, buried their dead beneath the floors of their living spaces, and decorated their walls with elaborate paintings and reliefs. Here was a society organized around shared space and shared ritual, one that had moved decisively into the Neolithic world, farming, herding, producing goods, while retaining a spiritual and communal intensity that connected it to much older ways of living. Çatalhöyük was not yet a city in the political sense. It had no palace, no king, no administrative hierarchy that archaeology has yet identified, but it was a community of considerable sophistication, and it set a template for settled life that would define the Anatolian world for millennia to come. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the era historians call the Early Bronze Age, Anatolia had grown considerably more complex. Trade networks stretched across the peninsula and beyond. Metals, particularly copper and tin, were being mined, alloyed into bronze, and exchanged across vast distances. Coastal and ravine settlements grew into small urban centers, and in the northwestern corner of the peninsula, at a site sitting astride the narrow straits where the Aegean meets the Sea of Marmara, a city was accumulating wealth at a pace that made it legendary in its own time. That city was Troy. The Troy of the early Bronze Age, known to archaeologists as Troy II, was a fortified citadel of considerable prosperity, its ruling elite buried with gold jewelry, silver vessels, and bronze weapons that speak to both local craftsmanship and wide-ranging connections. It would be destroyed, rebuilt,
destroyed again, and rebuilt once more across many centuries, but its position controlling the sea route between two worlds ensured that it never lost its strategic importance.
Around this same period, in the early 2nd millennium BCE, something new was taking shape in central Anatolia, something that would eventually become the first true empire the peninsula had ever known. The Hittites did not emerge from nothing. Their origins are complex and, in some respects, still debated. What is clear is that a people speaking an Indo-European language, the oldest Indo-European language preserved in writing, gradually established dominance over the central Anatolian plateau, absorbing, displacing, or incorporating the various communities they encountered. Their capital, known as Hattusa, was built among the rocky hills of north-central Anatolia, a location chosen as much for its defensibility as for its access to resources. The site was ringed by massive stone walls, punctuated by monumental gates carved with lions and sphinxes, and filled with temples, storehouses, and administrative buildings that reflected a state of genuine institutional ambition. The early Hittite kings, figures such as Pitana and his son Anita, who are known from some of the earliest royal inscriptions in Anatolian history, were aggressive consolidators. Anita, in particular, left behind a text that reads as both historical record and political proclamation, describing his military campaigns, the cities he destroyed, and the territories he brought under his authority. When he destroyed the city of Hattusa, he reportedly cursed it, declaring that no one should rebuild it. The fact that the later Hittite state made Hattusa its capital is one of history's more eloquent ironies.
The period known as the Old Hittite Kingdom, beginning around 1650 BCE, saw the emergence of a more coherent and expansionist state. The king Hattusili I, whose very name reflects his identification with the city, launched campaigns southward into Syria, striking at the cities of northern Mesopotamia that had long been part of the Assyrian commercial orbit. His successor, Mursili I, went further still. Around 1595 BCE, Mursili led Hittite army down through Syria and into Mesopotamia itself, sacking the great city of Babylon and bringing an end to the dynasty of Hammurabi. It was a raid rather than a permanent conquest. The Hittites did not hold Babylon, but as a demonstration of military reach, it was extraordinary. A power centered in the Anatolian highlands had struck the heart of the ancient Near East. What made the early Hittite state capable of such ambition was not simply military strength, though that was certainly part of it. The Hittites possessed a sophisticated understanding of chariot warfare, using light, fast vehicles to create mobility on the battlefield that older infantry-based armies struggled to counter. They also demonstrated from early in their history a capacity for political organization that went beyond brute force. The Hittite king governed not as an absolute autocrat, but within a framework that included a council of nobles, the Punku, whose authority could check royal excess. Laws were codified, treaties were formalized, records were kept in an extensive archive of clay tablets that would eventually number in the thousands. The Hittite state was in the fullest sense a bureaucratic empire. The height of Hittite power came during the period historians call the New Kingdom, between roughly 1400 and 1200 BCE. This era produced the empire's greatest kings and its most consequential confrontations. Under Suppiluliuma I, who came to the throne around 1344 BCE, the Hittite Empire reached its maximum territorial extent. Suppiluliuma was one of the most formidable rulers of the ancient Near Eastern world, a king who combined military genius with diplomatic cunning in a way that reshaped the balance of power across an enormous region. His campaigns into Syria dismantled the Mitanni kingdom, a powerful rival that had dominated the upper Euphrates Valley for generations, and brought the wealthy cities of northern Syria, including Carchemish and Aleppo, into the Hittite sphere. At the height of his reign, Suppiluliuma corresponded as an equal with the pharaohs of Egypt,
exchanging embassies, goods, and occasionally daughters in the complex diplomacy of great power politics. One episode from this period stands out for its sheer strangeness. Following the death of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, his widow, whose name may have been Ankhesenamun, sent a remarkable letter to Suppiluliuma. She wrote that she had no son, that she did not wish to take a servant as her husband, and that she was requesting one of the Hittite king's sons to marry and become pharaoh of Egypt. Suppiluliuma, understandably suspicious, sent an envoy to verify the claim. The widow confirmed it. A Hittite prince was dispatched to Egypt. He never arrived, killed, it seems, before he could take the throne, likely by Egyptian court factions opposed to foreign rule. It is one of history's most tantalizing near misses, the moment when Anatolia and Egypt came within a marriage of uniting under a single dynasty.
However, the very world that the Hittite-Egyptian treaty was designed to stabilize was beginning to fracture. The late 13th century BCE was a period of extraordinary disruption across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. A coalition of peoples, referred to in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, though their precise identities and origins remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate, began moving in waves through the Aegean and along the coasts of Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. They struck cities, disrupted trade routes, and appear to have contributed to the collapse of several Bronze Age societies in rapid succession. Ugarit, one of the most prosperous trading cities of the ancient world, was destroyed around 1185 BCE and never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece collapsed. Cyprus was severely disrupted. The long-distance trade networks that had sustained Bronze Age prosperity, the movement of tin and copper, of grain and textiles, of luxury goods across thousands of miles, began to break down. Around this same time, internal pressures were mounting within the Hittite state itself. There is evidence of famine in the empire's final decades. Letters survive in which Hittite kings urgently request grain shipments from Egypt. The agricultural productivity of the central Anatolian plateau, always somewhat fragile, appears to have declined, possibly due to climate shifts that reduced rainfall across the region. And the military demands of defending an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates were placing strains on a state apparatus that had never been unlimited in its resources. This would eventually lead to a crisis from which the Hittite Empire would not recover. However, the very world that the Hittite-Egyptian treaty was designed to stabilize was beginning to fracture. The late 13th century BCE was a period of extraordinary disruption across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. A coalition of peoples, referred to in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, though their precise identities and origins remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate, began moving in waves through the Aegean and along the coasts of Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. They struck cities, disrupted trade routes, and appear to have contributed to the collapse of several Bronze Age societies in rapid succession. Ugarit, one of the most prosperous trading cities of the ancient world, was destroyed around 1185 BCE and never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece collapsed. Cyprus was severely disrupted. The long-distance trade networks that had sustained Bronze Age prosperity, the movement of tin and copper, of grain and textiles, of luxury goods across thousands of miles, began to break down. Around this same time, internal pressures were mounting within the Hittite state itself. There is evidence of famine in the empire's final decades. Letters survive in which Hittite kings urgently request grain shipments from Egypt. The agricultural productivity of the central Anatolian plateau, always somewhat fragile, appears to have declined, possibly due to climate shifts that reduced rainfall across the region. And the military demands of defending an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates were placing strains on a state apparatus that had never been unlimited in its resources. This would eventually lead to a crisis from which the Hittite Empire would not recover.
Around 1200 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned and burned. The great capital of the Hittite world, its temples, its palaces, its vast archive of clay tablets, was destroyed. The destruction was thorough, and the city was not rebuilt in any significant form for centuries. What exactly happened remains one of the great unanswered questions of ancient history. The evidence points not to a single cause, but to a convergence of pressures. The disruptions of the Sea Peoples, which destabilized the trade networks and frontier regions the empire depended upon, the internal stresses of famine and administrative overextension, and possibly the actions of regional powers and subject peoples who saw an opportunity in the empire's weakness. Some scholars have pointed to the possibility of internal revolt. Others emphasize external attack. The clay tablets from Hattusa's final years convey a tone of urgency and uncertainty, a civilization aware, perhaps, that something was coming to an end. What followed the Hittite collapse was not an immediate replacement by another empire, but rather a period of fragmentation. The palace-based economies of the Bronze Age gave way to smaller, more localized forms of political organization. Across Anatolia, Iron Age cultures emerged, some of them descendants of Hittite populations, carrying forward elements of the older civilization in their art, their religion, and their political vocabulary. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, what historians call the Neo-Hittite states preserved Hittite cultural traditions for several more centuries, writing in Luwian hieroglyphs and maintaining artistic styles that clearly descended from the imperial period. The Hittites, in other words, did not simply disappear. They transformed, dispersed, and in some measure endured. Anatolia itself went on to host new powers, the Phrygians, whose king Midas became legendary across the ancient world, the Lydians, credited with the invention of coinage, the kingdom of Urartu in the east, and eventually the expanding ambitions of Persia, Greece, and Rome. Each of these later civilizations would encounter an Anatolia already deeply shaped by the millennia of development that preceded them.
The story of ancient Anatolia is not simply one of rise and fall, but of persistent invention, a land that generated new forms of human organization, new technologies of power, and new models of cultural exchange across an unbroken arc of thousands of years. From the ritual gathering places of Göbekli Tepe to the mud-brick neighborhoods of Çatalhöyük, from the fortified citadel of Troy to the imperial archives of Hattusa, Anatolia produced a record of human achievement that deserves to stand alongside the great narratives of Egypt and Mesopotamia, not as a footnote to those stories, but as a chapter of equal weight and consequence. The Hittites, in particular, left a legacy that extends far beyond the boundaries of their empire. They demonstrated that a land-based power in the Anatolian interior could project force and influence across an enormous region. They developed legal and diplomatic frameworks, the codified law, the formal treaty, the principle of mutual obligation between states that anticipated, in striking ways, the international norms of later civilizations. And they showed that empire, at its most functional, is not merely a military phenomenon, but an administrative, cultural, and intellectual achievement. There is also something worth noting in the manner of their ending. The collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1200 BCE was part of a broader catastrophe that swept away much of the Bronze Age world, a reminder that even the most sophisticated human systems are embedded in environmental, ecological, and interconnected economic realities that no amount of military power can fully control. The lesson is not a comfortable one, but it is an honest one, and it echoes across the centuries in ways that are difficult to dismiss. This is the story of ancient Anatolia, a peninsula of mountains, rivers, and plains stretching between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between Europe and Asia, and of the first empires that rose upon its soil. We will follow a civilizational arc spanning thousands of years, from the earliest settled communities that clustered around its fertile valleys, through the emergence of sophisticated Bronze Age kingdoms, to the eventual rise of one of the ancient world's most formidable military powers, the Hittite Empire. Throughout this journey, we will witness how geography shaped culture, how culture enabled power, and how power, in time, gave way to something new. As a note to our viewers, throughout this documentary, we will be using AI-generated imagery to help bring some of these ancient landscapes, cities, and peoples to life, adding a visual dimension to a world that left behind very few images of itself. The goal is not reconstruction, but imagination informed by evidence. Now, let us begin.
The reign of Muwatalli II produced what remains the most famous episode of Hittite history, the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Egyptian forces of Ramesses II around 1274 BCE. Near the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in modern Syria, two of the ancient world's greatest empires met in a clash of chariots and infantry on a scale rarely seen in the Bronze Age world. The battle was inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory, both sides suffered, but what followed was arguably more significant than the battle itself. Around 1259 BCE, Muwatalli's successor, Hattusili III, and Ramesses II signed what is often called the world's oldest surviving peace treaty. Copies were recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. The two powers agreed to mutual defense, the return of refugees, and the maintenance of their respective spheres of influence. It was a document of remarkable sophistication, and it stands as evidence that the ancient world was capable of constructing international order through negotiation as well as force.
The clay tablets of Hattusa were buried under the ruins of the city for more than 3,000 years before archaeologists began to unearth them in the early 20th century. When scholars finally deciphered the Hittite language and began to read those texts, an entire civilization spoke again. A civilization that had governed empires, negotiated with pharaohs, and wrestled with questions of law, justice, and power in terms that are, even across that vast distance of time, recognizably human. Anatolia gave the world some of its earliest cities, some of its first empires, and some of its most enduring contributions to the shared vocabulary of civilization. The land itself, that bridge between continents, that crossroads of cultures, ensured that whatever was born there would not remain contained for long. Ideas, peoples, technologies, and beliefs moved outward from Anatolia in every direction, shaping the ancient world in ways that can still be traced in the cultures and institutions of today. The story of the first empires of ancient Anatolia is not a closed chapter. It is a foundation, one that the rest of history was built upon, whether the builders knew it or not.
Anatolia's story doesn't end here. There are kingdoms, conquests, and civilizations still to cover, and we're just getting started. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and let us know in the comments, what part of this history surprised you most?